Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Welcome back to Cineversary, a podcast that celebrates a milestone anniversary of a masterful work of cinema. Each month we send happy birthday wishes to a different film currently observing a joyous jubilee. That's everything from a 20th all the way to a 100th anniversary. I'm your host, Eric Martin, creator and moderator of the Cineverse Film Discussion Group that now meets weekly on Zoom. Yeah, it's hard to believe that it's now been 3 decades since one of the masterworks of the mob movie subgenre was released. But as ex-gangster Henry Hill would tell you, time flies when you're having fun. And that's exactly what we hope to have with this installment of the podcast, which will honor the 30th anniversary of Goodfellas, directed by Martin Scorsese. So if you've been listening to this show long enough, of course, you know that I pride myself on getting only the very best guests, right? And this month is no exception. So I was lucky enough to get esteemed film critic, journalist, and author Glenn Kenny to join me in this outing. And fittingly so, because Glenn's newest book, Made Men, The Story of Goodfellas, well, it's hot off the presses. Now, Glenn and I are going to go deep undercover to examine why this film is worth celebrating all these years later, its impact and legacy, what we can learn from Goodfellas today, how it has stood the test of time, and more. And we won't even have to enter the witness protection program to do so, thankfully. Ha ha ha. Prior to sharing my interview with Glenn, let me get you up to speed on the fast and furious backstory of Goodfellas. Now, this is a la Wikipedia. Goodfellas is a 1990 American crime film directed by Scorsese, produced by Irwin Winkler, and distributed by Warner Brothers. It's an adaptation of the 1985 nonfiction book Wise Guy by Nicholas Pileggi, who co-wrote the screenplay with Scorsese. The film stars Robert De Niro, Ray Liotta, Joe Pesci, Lorraine Bracco, and Paul Sorvino, among others. It narrates the rise and fall of mob associate Henry Hill and his friends and family from 1955 to 1980. Scorsese initially titled the movie Wise Guy and postponed making it. Later, he and Pileggi changed the title to Goodfellas. To prepare for their roles in the film, De Niro, Pesci, and Liotta often spoke with Pileggi, who shared research material left over from writing the book. According to Pesci, improvisation and ad-libbing came out of rehearsals wherein Scorsese gave the actors freedom to do whatever they wanted. The director made transcripts of these sessions, took the lines he liked most, and put them into a revised script, which the cast worked from during principal photography. Goodfellas premiered at the 47th Venice International Film Festival on September 9, 1990, where Scorsese was awarded the Silver Lion for Best Director. Goodfellas was ultimately released in the United States on September 17, 1990, and the film was made on a budget of $25 million, grossing $46.8 million. The critical consensus on Rotten Tomatoes, where, by the way, the film earns a 96% fresh rating and an average critical score of 9.03 out of 10, calls it, quote, arguably the high point of Martin Scorsese's career, unquote. The film was nominated for 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director, with Pesci winning for Best Supporting Actor. The film won 5 awards from the British Academy of Film and Television Arts, including Best Film and Best Director. Additionally, Goodfellas was named the year's best film by various critics groups. On a side note, worldofreal.com has named Goodfellas the best movie of the 1990s. Now, that was based on the results of a poll of directors, actors, producers, festival programmers, and historians. Indeed, Goodfellas is widely regarded as one of the greatest films ever made, particularly in the gangster genre. In 2000, it was deemed culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant and selected for preservation in the National Film Registry of the United States Library of Congress. All right, enough of the yammering. To set the proper vibe, let's tune our ears to an early trailer for Goodfellas.
As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster.
I know I'd go from rags to riches.
To me, being a gangster was better than being president of the United States.
Never rat on your friends, and always keep your mouth shut.
It meant being somebody in the neighborhood that was full of nobodies.
Oh, you broke it, Jerry!
doing? You look like a gangster.
By the time I grew up, there was $30 billion a year in cargo moving through Idlewild Airport, and believe me, we tried to steal every bit of it.
You might know who we are, but we know who you are. You understand?
Yeah.
What kind of people are these?
What do you do?
I'm in construction. If we wanted something, we just took it, and you didn't even think about it. To us, it was better than Citibank.
Nice. Great, but nice.
You got some nerve standing me up. Nobody does that to me. Who the hell do you think you are? Frankie Valli or some kind of big shot?
I was living in a fantasy.
Look at my eyes.
He's not Jewish.
For most of the guys, killings got to be accepted. Murder was the only way that everybody stayed in line.
What are we gonna do with him? We can't just dump him on the street.
Don't worry. I know a place up safe. They'll never find him.
You got out of line, you got whacked. Everybody knew the rules.
Hey, Henry. Here's an arm.
Very funny, guys.
Here's a leg.
There's a wing. What do you like, the leg or the wing, Henry?
Okay, you ready?
Sometimes
For us, to live any other way was nuts. Anything I wanted was a phone call away. And we were treated like movie stars with muscle. We had it all just for the asking.
It's gonna be a good summer.
It was a glorious time.
In a world that's powered by violence, on the streets where the violent have power, a new generation carries on an old tradition.
All right, at this point, it's my duty to remind you yet again that we're about to venture, fellow travelers, into Spoilerland. Glenn and I are going to be discussing critical plot points and spilling the beans on Goodfellas secrets, much like an FBI informant. So consider yourself forewarned, and if you're one of the maybe handful of people who perhaps have awakened from a 30-year-long coma and have never laid eyes on this month's film, well, here's your chance to hit pause, watch said movie, and come back to this spot fully enlightened. All set? Here we go. It's my pleasure to introduce Glenn Kenny, a film critic, scholar, writer, and expert on the movie Goodfellas. Glenn, thanks so much for appearing on Cineversary.
Well, thank you for having me.
What's the name of your book and when is it coming out?
The book is called Made Men, The Story of Goodfellas. It's published by Hanover Square Press, and it comes out on September 15th. It talks about the making of the film, the people who were in it, the people who helped make it, the author Nick Pileggi, who wrote Wise Guy, the book on which the movie was based. I talk about the real life of Henry Hill, kind of fall after the fall of his post-Goodfellas and Wise Guy fame, and some unexpected characters as well. But it also talks about every single song in the movie. I think it's hopefully a definitive guide to Goodfellas for fans of the film and people who are new to the movie as well, I think.
We're definitely going to get more details on that book as the interview progresses, but let's get into the film first and why it's worth celebrating 30 years later. So Goodfellas, released in September of 1990, kind of took the world by storm, especially in critical circles, but also was quite a popular movie as well. But I want to ask you when and where you first saw Goodfellas, and Glenn, why is this movie important to you?
I think I saw the film shortly after its release. I was working at a magazine called Video Review, and it was through that magazine that I, as a journalist, met Martin Scorsese for the first time. And when I met him for the first time, he was in the middle of editing Goodfellas. It's an interesting story. My magazine was called Video Review. It was about home video. This was 1985. I started working there, and I met Scorsese in '89. This was a time that we cannot imagine now, when home video and home video software and home video gear were so ubiquitous and huge that they could support an entire consumer, not trade magazine. And Video Review was all about the latest releases on VHS and Laserdisc, which were the two mediums at the time. And our magazine was celebrating its 10th anniversary, and our publisher wanted a lot of big names to make contributions to the magazine. And I thought, Martin Scorsese is very highly involved in film preservation at the time, and it's been a continuing passion of his. And he also contributed introductions to presentations of classic films on VHS and Laserdisc. So he knew from home video he was adept. So I thought, let's go in and talk to him, or rather, let's have him write an essay about this topic. And he wasn't going to write it by himself. He was going to do an as told to. I would go to his office and we would discuss the topic, and I would draft about 12 to 1,500 words, and he'd sign off on it and approve it. And it was at this time he was doing Goodfellas. He was editing Goodfellas, which at the time was called Wise Guy, named after the book of the same name by Nick Pileggi, who co-wrote the script with Scorsese.
That's right.
And he was very excited about the film. He said it was unlike any film he had ever made before. I'd been following Scorsese since I was a teenager, seeing Mean Streets when I was about 12. A lot of it went a bit over my head, but there was something about his films that spoke to me very directly. As a living in New Jersey, being from an Italian-American background, there was a big personal connection there. And then, of course, there was the very dynamic filmmaking, the very personal filmmaking. Scorsese films at the time were The Color of Money, which was a somewhat less personal movie for him, but it was an important film for his career because it was done through the aegis of a studio, and it proved to the studio, the bosses, the execs who never really understood Scorsese anyway, that he could deliver a film on time and on budget and not be a problem child, which, you know, a lot of the filmmakers of the Raging Bulls, Easy Riders, Raging Bull era, so-called, were known as kind of profligate spenders, and you know, Coppola and so on. But Color of Money proved that Scorsese could, you know, play in the studio's yard. It's a movie he's not that crazy about himself these days. But it was not as strong a film as a lot of the things that we'd come up with, like Mean Streets and Taxi Driver, New York, Raging Bull, and so on. So in a sense, Goodfellas, he didn't say this to me at the time, but he was very excited about Goodfellas because, and I think he felt it might be able to give him a new lease on his filmmaking life, a new direction in his filmmaking. You know, he had done Last Temptation, which had been a big passion project and is an outstanding film. There had been a lot of pushback on that, and it had not done well at the box office. And Goodfellas, I think he thought of as not just a dynamic, interesting film that he made in a way that was different from his other films, but also a film that could conceivably do well in a commercial setting. So we talked about that. So naturally, when the film came out, less than a year after our conversation, we met around Christmas time, 1989, and Goodfellas came out in September of 1990. I was very much excited to see it, and I went to a theater that was around the corner from the office of Video Review where I worked. And I think I played hooky from work. I took the afternoon off, and I saw the film, and it just kind of brought me into its world instantly. You know, it's got a very unusual beginning, and the beginning is kind of a test for the audience because the beginning is almost unconscionably violent. It's the scene where they're driving to bury Billy Batts, and Billy Batts isn't dead yet. They thought they killed him. He's still alive. They pull over and open the trunk. The enraged Tommy, played by Joe Pesci, stabs him through a sheet that he's been wrapped in, and then Robert De Niro's character, Jimmy the Gent Conway, shoots him 4 or 5 times. And the odd man out in this scene is Ray Liotta as Henry Hill. And the punchline of that scene is, for as long as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster. And why? Why did you want to be a gangster after what has just been shown?
Yeah, it pulls you in right from that first sequence, doesn't it?
But you're curious, and the rest of the film, well, provides answers to the question of why. You understand why, but then you understand also what he has to pay for it eventually.
Wow, the great recollections. Thank you for sharing that, Glenn. So let's dig a little deeper here. Why is Goodfellas worth celebrating 30 years later? Why does it still matter, Glenn, and how has it stood the test of time?
First of all, it's still an amazing film to watch. I watched it more than 30 times front to back in the process of doing this book over the course of more than a year.
That's homework for you.
Saying it never gets old is maybe not the most appropriate phrase, but it certainly has a vitality and a freshness, and the shots and cuts are so dynamic that there's a sense of life pulsating through the whole film. Scorsese and myself, we grew up with the same generation of film critics who propagated ideas about auteurs, the director being the ultimate author of the film,
right,
and the personal signature being the primary motor of the film's value. And I don't necessarily believe that specifically to be the case anymore. What I do believe is that if a filmmaker can bring life to the screen, then they're doing their job. And by life, I don't necessarily mean realism, but just sort of a pulsating heart, a conviction, an image of actual life, and make you believe that. That's the most important component of a film, I think.
Sure. Yeah, I agree.
So I think that Goodfellas is steeped and suffused with that kind of life. There's a vibrancy to it in the performances, in the often profane and sacrilegious dialogue, in the action, the violence, not just the violence, but the passion of the characters.
Mm-hmm.
Henry's sometimes passion for Karen, Henry's passion for money, which does not step up to a passion for power. He's a very kind of simplistic, superficial guy, but what he enjoys, we think, to the fullest. His reaction when the Lufthansa heist is announced on the AM radio in the morning while he's in the shower, and his ebullience, which has become an internet meme. That character, as played so beautifully by Ray Liotta, he's a living, breathing thing, and you're invested in his fall as much as his rise because of the vivacity of not just the performance, but the filmmaking. And the filmmaking 30 years later still never fails in that respect.
Totally agree. Yeah, for my take here, I think Goodfellas is without question one of the most influential movies of the last 3 decades. And we'll get into that more maybe in the next question. But to me, it still matters because it has so many elements that combine to make for a great viewing experience. You've already touched on so many of these, but you got fantastic performances by a top-notch cast. You have a riveting episodic narrative structure that's constantly moving, brilliant directorial and editing choices. This fantastic soundtrack of carefully curated popular music. It's infused with meticulous attention to detail for each year depicted, each era. And this quickly shifting tonality that takes us on kind of a roller coaster ride of emotions, Glenn. One moment we're laughing at the exploits of Henry and his friends, and the next we're shocked by sudden violence and brutality, and later feeling somber and melancholy at the unexpected deaths of even small characters we've come to appreciate, right?
Yes, definitely.
To me, the movie's infinitely quotable lines of dialogue have certainly helped it stand the test of time as well. You talked about internet memes. I just remember I listened to a lot of talk radio in the 90s, and after this movie came out, there were so many sampled lines of dialogue just infused in that decade. And it still gets talked about, obviously. There's still some famous lines and things. I think it also matters because it manages to tell multiple stories exceedingly well. And I think that the fact that it has 2 voiceover narrations and 2 points of view kind of supports this. You got Henry's, POV and voiceover, and Karen's. Mm-hmm. And there are also 2 tales woven into this picture. The first tale kind of introduces us to Henry's profession and the people in his life, and it's told in a kind of nostalgic way that romanticizes his good fortune and privileges, right? And then you have the second tale, which arguably begins maybe when Tommy shoots Spider dead, which could mark a turning point for the audience by showing the negative side of this lifestyle and its violence and inhumane repercussions. Anything you want to riff on these thoughts?
Well, for sure. I think that one interesting fact about the film is that it doesn't quite identify with the gangster characters so much that you can't get off the bus with them at any time and still kind of engage in the narrative. The thing about these guys is that they have a lot of vivacity. Their interaction is often funny. They have this code that they profess to follow, which they violate at the slightest provocation to do so. So it's not really a code at all. But they're also racist, they're homophobic, they're nasty people.
Absolutely.
Despite this kind of movie star charisma that they think they have and that they exude on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a sort of a disjoint that I talk about a bit in the book that goes all the way back to Taxi Driver with Robert De Niro as the psychotic Travis Bickle. He's an unusual looking movie star, but he's still a movie star, and you still get that charisma as he's playing Bickle. So there's a kind of a alienation effect just because of the fact that he's a charismatic actor in a Hollywood film. But I think Scorsese plays with this to a large extent because that's where you get the toggle of moral ambiguity about what you're looking at and what you're identifying with. But you can see their behavior. It's not hidden. It's not like all of a sudden the other shoe drops and you realize, oh, these are, kind of bad dudes. They're bad from the beginning, and yet they're charming. Then there's the story of this rise and fall, and then there's the sort of scenes from a marriage,
right,
in which you get the point of view of Karen and Henry and so on and so and have their ups and downs, and that's fascinating too because you get Karen's point of view very, very explicitly.
Yes.
Karen often seems more like a Scorsese character than Henry does. Henry, unlike a lot of the characters that Scorsese has made films about in things such as Raging Bull, King of Comedy, these are very alienated and very obsessive characters.
That's true.
Raging Bull's Jake LaMotta in particular is, sexually obsessed with his wife Vicky and, kind of looks at her in this way that's hallucinatory. And Henry is just much more casual about interpersonal relationships with women than any of the other Scorsese characters. And so for Goodfellas, Scorsese actually transfers this kind of obsessive jealousy to Karen.
Interesting.
When Karen realizes that Henry's been having an affair with Janice, she kind of goes crazy. And the scenes where she's visiting him in prison and she sees Janice's name in the logbook and all those very quick, like 11 shots in 1.5 seconds or something, inserts of the names until she sees Janice's name and she flips out. That's a very Jake LaMotta thing to do. That's not Henry. Henry is very casual about these things.
Yeah.
But Karen is not. And so Scorsese's stylistic flourishes with respect to Karen are more reflective of the kind of crazed characters Scorsese's portrayed in the past.
I've never thought about it that way. That is really well put and so much food for thought. In what ways is Goodfellas innovative or influential on cinema and, for that matter, popular culture?
Well, what's quite interesting is that at the time he was making it, Scorsese said, I'm doing this. It's the most television-like film I've ever done. And you don't look at the movie and see it being very television-like unless you really do a very deep dish analysis of it.
Yeah, what did he mean by that?
Because he was influenced in the filmmaking style by tabloid television. But it's also a combination of tabloid television and the French New Wave, when there's those scenes of still photograph, where the camera resolves into a still photograph and there's flashbulbs going off and the very quick cutting of still images and so on. That's both from the French New Wave, but it's also from the tabloid television material of the time, such as early Inside Edition and so on and so forth. And this very kind of like not nuanced, blaring narrative signpost coming up. He also talked about the old 50s show, The Untouchables. He was very specific that he was not talking about his friend Brian De Palma's movie, The Untouchables, but rather The Untouchables, the 50s and 60s television show starring Robert Stack,
right,
which had unusually brutal violence, but also unusually brutal pacing. And a lot of the times in Goodfellas, the pacing is just very, very breakneck. But also the theme of the gangster foot soldier. Mm-hmm. That was a big deal because films prior to that were always focused on the gangster kingpin.
That's right.
Public Enemy, Little Caesar. Now, all these films, these characters started as foot soldiers, but they didn't stay that way for long. So that became the paradigm of the United States gangster movie. In Europe, there were different films that did have foot soldiers. Some of Jacques Becker's work in the 50s, like Touché pas le Grisby. They weren't about bosses. They were about regular, working stiff criminals. But in American film, that was unique. And that's part of the reason that Scorsese liked the material of Nick Pileggi's book, Wise Guy. He said, I wasn't interested in making another mob movie, but this one, told from the point of view of a mafia foot soldier, was really interesting because you really get into the nitty gritty of what it was like. And that was what was interesting to him. So you have that idea of a foot soldier, but also the way that these guys are portrayed psychologically, I think, led directly to a send-up movie like Analyze This, which Robert De Niro plays a mafia capo who undergoes psychoanalysis.
Right.
Goodfellas and that combined were kind of the template for what became The Sopranos. And The Sopranos was a television series that changed television overall.
Sure.
You can see its influence in everything from Mad Men to Breaking Bad and much, much, much more. And then there's the influence on a filmmaker such as Quentin Tarantino, where you have the opening scene of Reservoir Dogs, where you have these kind of dirtbag guys in their black suits and black ties and white shirts, and they're sitting at a table in a diner, and they're talking trash about Madonna, and that sort of thing. I don't think you'd get that. I mean, and again, for Tarantino, the influence of writers like Elmore Leonard is as important, if not more important, than the influence of filmmakers like Scorsese. But combined, you don't get that dynamic from Reservoir Dogs without Goodfellas. So those are two big things. And the way that the tendrils spread from those films of Tarantino's is also quite formidable. So yeah, Goodfellas is so influential that there's a lot of people out there who are of the rather bizarre and ignorant holding that Scorsese only directs gangster movies, which is very, very far
ridiculous.
Yeah.
Go see Kundun or Age of Innocence, for example. I mean, such a diverse array of work, right?
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, you think of, you name dropped some of the obvious ones, of course, Quentin Tarantino, The Sopranos. You think of movies in the wake of Goodfellas like Donnie Brasco, of course, Casino, which is kind of like Goodfellas Part 2. But The Usual Suspects, Boogie Nights borrows so heavily from this film and its structure and its characters. American Hustle, Requiem for a Dream with the drug references, 54, Blow, Lord of War, Black Mass, just to name a handful. I mean, we could see, as you put it so eloquently, the tendrils from this film kind of emanating outward, and other filmmakers kind of picking up the cue from Goodfellas.
Yeah, I emailed with Paul Thomas Anderson recently, and he said the word he used to describe Goodfellas in his own cosmology was inescapable.
I mean, if you're going to make a movie with crime elements and violent characters, it's almost impossible not to be influenced by Goodfellas to some extent, I would imagine, in the past 30 years. It's just so pervasive in the culture and so kind of intrinsic and just accepted among movie viewers that when you combine that with The Sopranos' influence in television and streaming, you see how, like you said, it's inescapable. You're going to probably reference something to Goodfellas in some way. Do you agree?
Yes, it's very much out there. And to a certain extent, I think that, the films he made that have gangster themes after Goodfellas not only could not have existed without Goodfellas, but there's a sense in which Goodfellas provides them with an outside of the storyline context, to be sure, especially The Irishman. The Irishman is about a different kind of what happens when the music stops.
Yeah, absolutely. No question. And the way that he's able to continue this arc of storytelling across the mob template throughout his career has been quite astounding. And I was just so thrilled when I heard about The Irishman coming out. He was working on it, and then it lived up to expectations for me. So again, that legacy of Goodfellas continues, even in his most recent work. I want to share some other thoughts about how this film could have been innovative or inspiring to other filmmakers or pop culture for that matter. We can agree, right? This movie didn't invent or introduce any new techniques per se, but I think it's noteworthy for containing an array of memorable shots and cinematic approaches that collectively make for an exceptionally creative end product. So, right from the start, the film opens with a flash forward that is later repeated. And that's the scene where Henry, Jimmy, and Tommy stop the car, as you said. The dead of night, open the trunk, reveal the victim of their violent vocation. They stab him and shoot him. It contains 2 extended and unbroken tracking shots, of course. The famous shot where they track through the bowels of the Copacabana.
So there's the Copacabana shot.
That's right. And then earlier, the other tracking shot.
The Meet the Gang shot
Exactly.
in the Bamboo Lounge, which Larry McConkey, the Steadicam operator, he thinks that's more of a real Steadicam shot than the Copa shot.
Wow.
Just because of the fact that the camera goes places that mere mortals cannot. There's a third Steadicam shot that's a tale into itself. But yeah, let's talk about those two.
We've seen this before. It's not like Scorsese invented this or broke new ground per se. But again, memorable scenes and just so perfect for telling the story and introducing these characters, right? And then you think of like when Henry testifies in court. He breaks the fourth wall. That's been done before, of course. But he addresses the audience briefly, and then you jump to the last shot of the film where Tommy fires a pistol directly at the camera, a nod to an earlier silent film. What is it, The Great Train Robbery, I think it was?
Right.
So many examples here of Scorsese kind of taking from earlier influences and making something unique. The camera seems to me to be regularly in movement throughout this story, and that's complemented by smart and sometimes daring editing choices. To me, Glenn, Goodfellas feels like a frenetic car ride that never stops, which is fitting when you consider the opening credit sequence by, is it Saul Bass and his wife, I think it is?
Saul and Elaine Bass, yes.
That's right. It features these words and names that quickly zoom by horizontally like speedy automobiles. So right from the start, he's setting you up for this is going to be a fast, exhilarating ride. Then you think of how Scorsese briefly apes Hitchcock in the diner scene where Henry agrees to meet Jimmy. We see a glimpse of the disorienting dolly zoom vertigo effect. It's very brief. You got to pay attention, but it's like, whoa, something big's about to happen here. And then helping to immerse us into Henry's world, the film features several memorable POV shots. I think of like the gun in the face, the upside down view of the lion's den, and then we talked about the 2 tracking shots, those tour de force shots into the clubs. And there's also a lot of close-up shots of smaller objects like weapons, guns, and things like that. Other objects are shown as tools of the trade. You got like kind of strange close-ups on like keys and restaurant checks and doorbells. Anything you make of that?
Oh, yeah. Well, I actually spoke with Bob Griffin, who was the prop master on Goodfellas. He said to me, one thing you learn on a Scorsese set is that if you've got a book, a log book, or anything like that, I have the quote right here. When Karen goes to the prison, there's that sequence I told you about where you have several very close-up shots of the logbook, and there's names in them. And I list some of the names. Here's the passage from the book. Property master Bob Griffin glommed very quickly on Scorsese's tendencies. Faced with a scene featuring a document, he is likely to shoot that document in great detail, so it had better be ready to shoot. The reason that the log has the names of the crew members in there is, according to Bob Griffin, crew names are always technically clear, so you could use them, right? But the other thing we wanted, lots of different handwriting, because the thing about Marty is you have to be prepared that almost anything can get inserted. He loves inserts, and he will do them to death, so you have to be ready for all that.
Right.
Because, and this is the reason why, and this is something I bring up in the first chapter, he says, Goodfellas is frequently cited as the most realistic American movie about organized crime ever made, and in a sense it is, but the movie's director does not make movies that are by any yardstick objectively realistic. Rather, he makes movies that explicitly reflect his own perception. In the late 80s, he recounted to an interviewer, I read in the Village Voice that Jim Jarmusch, who made Stranger Than Paradise and Down by Law, knowing aesthetically offbeat minimalist comedies with long static shots of characters standing or sitting around talking, said something like, I'm not interested in taking people by the hair and telling them where to look. Well, Scorsese continued, I do want them to see the way I see, walking down the street, looking quickly about, tracking, panning, zooming, cutting, and all that sort of thing. I like it when 2 images go together and they move. So that's been Scorsese's ethos as a filmmaker ever since he started. And in Goodfellas, because of the influence of tabloid television and Untouchables and that sort of thing, that influence inspired him to push it farther than he'd pushed it since, for example, Raging Bull, with its incredible quick-cutting, literally hard-hitting boxing scenes.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I so appreciate you reading excerpts from the book. And again, we'll talk a little bit more at length about that toward the end here. But I'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about the soundtrack of the movie, because the movie lacks a proper original score. So instead, as we're so used to Scorsese doing ever since this movie, and he did it in Mean Streets too, I have to admit, but this movie, it seems like it set the template for, this is how you do a postmodern kind of film soundtrack. So instead of that proper score, you get a smorgasbord of pop tunes from the 50s through the 70s. I don't know, there might be a couple of 1980s tunes in there, but maybe not. But there's 43 songs in total, I researched, right? So you got like the classic crooning by, a Tony Bennett, contrasted with like punk rock caterwauling by Sid Vicious.
That's what brackets the film, yeah.
They bookend the film. And this certainly would have left a strong impression on many filmmakers, Quentin Tarantino, we're talking about you in particular, who, after seeing Goodfellas, adopted a similar approach. Now, what I find interesting, Glenn, is that Scorsese often doesn't play the majority of a song. He instead opts to use only a section or a snippet from a tune to punctuate a particular scene. Now, you think, of course, of the instrumental second half of the song Layla. He doesn't play the entire song Layla. He just plays like the piano and guitar instrumental part of the second half. Mm-hmm. And that's used so ingeniously as the musical bedrock to this melancholy montage of dead bodies being discovered following the Lufthansa heist. And I think also of like something like Muddy Waters' version of Manish Boy, which we just hear suddenly pop up after Henry does a snort of cocaine,
Well, actually, it's when he looks up and he sees no choppers in the sky.
Yep.
That's the first time it comes up.
You're right.
And it's Muddy Waters, and he's alone. There's a Johnny Winter is holding a single note on the guitar. Wow. And Muddy Waters says, well, and it's everything gonna be all right this morning. And then it cuts. And then later on, he's doing coke.
Yes.
And then when it cuts back in, it cuts exactly on that downbeat of the wow, 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 womp, and it's this big, beautiful sound, and it goes on from there. But the first thing is the lifting of the paranoia in the May 11th scene of the day that Henry finally gets arrested, and he's seeing choppers in the sky, and he's convinced that they're coming for him. He tells his brother they're coming for him. He tells everybody who'll listen to him they're coming for him. Then all of a sudden they're not there. And the thing that's in his head, even though he's not thinking of the song, that's the thing. These songs are Scorsese's consciousness standing in for the consciousness of the protagonist.
So interesting, yeah.
Everything's going to be all right this morning. The words are important there.
The lyrics are kind of commenting on the action a bit.
And this is the section of the film in which the music is coming from nowhere. In a lot of the other places in the film, the music is coming from a jukebox. When he has Sunshine of Your Love playing while De Niro's character is deciding whether or not to kill Maury, that's coming from the jukebox. Scorsese's rule when making this movie was everything on the soundtrack has to be from the time period in the soundtrack or before.
Chronologically accurate, right?
Sunshine of Your Love from the 60s is played in the 70s, but it had already been around. Yes. The other consideration, of course, is that mob guys didn't listen to Cream, psychedelic rock.
Good point.
They listened to Jimmy Roselli. But the rationale here is, they're in a bar and there's a jukebox and somebody's playing it on the jukebox. And that's enough to give Scorsese the rationale to use it because it had been in his mind since before the film was even made a deal on.
I read that. Yeah, he had all these songs in his head well before they wrote the screenplay, right? Isn't that true?
Nick Pileggi, who's doing the typing, he says to Nick Pileggi, put in the margin, in parentheses, Cream. And Nick's like, what? Because Nick never heard of Cream. He was the Sinatra and Tony Bennett guy.
Oh, okay.
And he had no idea what he was talking about until the film actually came out, and he heard the song and was told who it was by. It's like, oh, that's it, because it's in his head.
Yes.
He sees. It's almost like a form of synesthesia. He's seeing the music. The music is seeing the movie.
So cool.
So that's it, man.
Yeah, I mean, nobody does this better than Scorsese. I mean, Tarantino has kind of picked up that mantle, and he makes some great musical choices himself. And there's other filmmakers who do this too, of course. But again, it's just like this movie to me is the gold standard of that, where there's so many songs. But again, they're not complete songs. A lot of them are snippets, and a lot of them are like excerpts from songs in the middle of it or toward the end of it or what have you.
Well, Magic Bus
yeah.
by The Who, and
Yes.
it's him driving to rush to get to where he's going, and it's just Roger Daltrey saying, I want it, I want it, I want it.
It's great. Again, another example where the lyrics are commenting on what's going on in the character's head or
Very
in the situation.
So not always, though. I mean, What Is Life, the George Harrison song, the lyrics aren't as important, but what's important is the momentum.
Yeah, or the vibe, right?
The tambourine, the vibe, the big, beautiful Phil Spector pop vibe.
Totally. Yeah, I completely agree, because I wasn't reading into the lyrics there when that popped up. I was more like, oh, it's kind of a jaunty pop tune that, you know, has some happy connotations and things like that. But yet it just works. I don't know what it is.
You know, he's not just doing needle drops. He understands how this music is going to work, and he understands its effect in the context of what he's doing.
Totally.
And that's what makes him different than almost any other filmmaker who does a pop music song score these days. Who just, you know, nothing against Robert Zemeckis, but the whole point of the song soundtrack in Forrest Gump is to hit the nostalgia sweet spots for whatever year they're in.
It's a different approach.
That's it. There's nothing to do with anyone's consciousness.
Exactly. We need to talk briefly, at least, about the narrative, which, of course, is very episodic and elliptical. It like abandons a through-line plot, Goodfellas does, and instead it chooses to feature like vignettes of the characters that paint a composite picture of their lifestyle and their choices. And the several years that Henry spends in prison, for example, is glossed over. Unlike gangster heist films such as, let's say, Kubrick's The Killing, the film doesn't waste time showing us the actual Lufthansa heist or how it was executed. It's talked about. You see some brief, shots, but it's glossed over. The courtroom scene isn't milked for all of its dramatic impact like it could have been. It could have turned into this big, third act courtroom scene or something like that. So, yeah, what do you make of the narrative choices here?
Scorsese has gone on record as saying, he hates plot. Story is one thing, but plot is something that he has no interest in. And this is something that holds true for a lot of his films. If you look at Raging Bull, it's not structured in such a way that you have this rising and converging of the action leading to a catharsis and a resolution. He does a lot of bad things, and then he is old and no longer a boxer and fat, and he has to come to some sort of peace with himself and his life.
Right.
That's the story of Raging Bull. There's no plot.
Right.
So similarly, in Goodfellas, he knew when he read Wise Guy that, in a sense, the whole movie was May 11th, the day he's arrested, because it's the exhilaration, it's the chasing of the exhilaration, followed by the end of his life, the end of his career.
Absolutely.
Everything comes down. There is a sort of sense of the good times slipping away because people are losing their minds or getting killed when they're supposed to be made. The gang is doing different things. Jimmy, you get this sense of estrangement between Henry Hill and Jimmy. Tommy DeSimone is dead. This whole crew that they were going to be the three musketeers of Paulie's family, and they're on the outs with Paulie. He doesn't he thinks that Tommy's a cowboy. He thinks that Jimmy is too flagrant.
Yep.
And so there's this erosion of that bond, so to speak, occurring throughout the narrative as Tommy's actions get more irresponsible. But there's no definitive break.
Right.
And the definitive break is the actions of May 11th. So that becomes kind of focused. That's the narrative. And, when you see the first time, it's not something that necessarily people got a lot of. In fact, one of the first reviews of the film was by Todd McCarthy, who's still a working critic, and one of the best working critics we have, who used to write for Variety, and he wrote the review of Goodfellas from Venice when it played at the Venice Film Festival. He admired the filmmaking a great deal, but he also thought that the narrative was lacking. I have my account of it here. Todd McCarthy's September 10th review from Venice in the trade paper Variety was not entirely a rave. He called it a simultaneously fascinating and repellent film, noting sympathy is not the issue here, empathy is. He praised editor Thelma Schoonmaker's masterful editing, but complained that while the film is, quote, taut in the first half, it, quote, rambles seriously after that, wearing out its interest at least a half hour before it's over. Warming up to his point, the reviewer complained that the second half doesn't develop the dramatic conflict between the character and the milieu that are hinted at earlier. Yes, that second half, which features the aftermath of the Lufthansa heist and the macro detail of Henry's arrest day. I mean, he just didn't see it, and yet it's there right in front of you.
Right, absolutely.
As I say, in fairness to McCarthy, when you're filing reviews from film festivals, it's generally on the day of the screening, and under that tight deadline pressure, you might not have an entirely reliable assessment of certain aspects of a given picture, especially a picture as simultaneously breakneck and rich as Goodfellas is.
Absolutely. What messages or themes are explored in Goodfellas? So what's the moral to the story here, in your opinion?
There's no moral given. Actually, as in Taxi Driver, as in Raging Bull, Scorsese keeps overt judgment out of the picture. He never introduces a character who says, don't try this at home or that this is bad. But obviously there are figures who represent authority.
Yeah, there are themes that you can mine from here, right?
Edward McDonald, who plays himself in the film, projects a genuine sense of moral disgust when he's dealing with Henry and Karen and their witness relocation assignments.
Yes.
And he says, I don't care where you go. These are the guys who want to put him in jail because he's done these terrible things. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's not quite crime does not pay, but the final image of Henry looking at the camera with this, half smile and saying, I get to live the rest of my life like a schnook, cutting to Joe Pesci's Tommy dressed in an anachronistic hat and jacket, shooting, his gun into the camera lens, tells you this is a violent world. This is a dangerous world. And this is a world whose pleasures can be cut off from you with a snap of a finger. As Scorsese said to Terry Gross when he was questioned on the NPR radio show Fresh Air in January of this year, he says, you don't need to tell me that gangsters are bad. I know gangsters are bad. I mean, that should be the given that you're starting with. What we're talking about here is an examination of what they do, how they do it, and why we think it's cool. Mm-hmm. And why it's kind of almost sanctioned within the culture. This whole idea of bad boys doing bad things. Sure. What's the appeal? And the film examines that. And it's up to you to come to a moral conclusion.
Absolutely.
Just like it's up to you to reject the racism and the homophobia and the violence of the characters. It's not funny when Tommy shoots Spider. No. And yet he makes a joke out of it. He says, hey, what can I tell you? I'm a good shot. This is a moral abyss that these guys inhabit.
Right.
So the question, the judgment, the moral isn't there. The question is this how you want to live? Is this a way to live?
Right. Yeah. There are a handful of themes here that rise to the surface, for me anyway. And Scorsese, he nods to as much in the commentary on the Blu-ray or DVD. He talks about there's a fall from grace. Scorsese has said that Henry's life was akin to walking amongst the gods, but then he's cast from Mount Olympus after committing hubris and defying Zeus, if you will, in the form of maybe Paulie or the bosses above him. But yeah, I mean, this fall from grace, that's a timeless theme we see echoed in many pictures, right? Also, that there's no honor among thieves. We see how Jimmy becomes paranoid, decides to whack everyone involved in the Lufthansa heist to cover his tracks. Henry's also reminded not to break the two cardinal rules of the mob, which are never rat on your friends and keep your mouth shut. But by the end of the film, he's violated those two commandments.
Everybody violates them. That's the thing. The fall from grace is an interesting theme, but, it's not the whole picture. None of these guys make it out alive. Mm-hmm. Jimmy Conway, Jimmy Burke in real life dies in prison. Paulie Vario, Paul Cicero in the film, I think, dies in prison. Other guys get killed. They get shot in the back of the head. I mean, nobody gets out of life alive, whether you're a criminal or a saint. But the way these guys get out is pretty extreme.
No question. And then a last theme that stuck with me anyway is that we are a product of our environment.
Oh, yeah.
Goodfellas, to me, is a lesson in how your culture shapes your values and your lifestyle for better or worse.
He's looking out that window at the age of 12 and seeing the guys at the cab stand pizza parlor, and they seem to have the world by the tail. They do whatever they want, whenever they want, except when Paulie comes out and scolds them. And he says in the voiceover, he says, being a gangster looked better than being the president of the United States. Now, of course, you have a president of the United States who is a gangster.
Yeah. Goodfellas Part 2 coming soon.
There you go.
All right, Glenn, with Cineversary, we celebrate a milestone anniversary of a major motion picture, and Goodfellas is certainly that. So this is a birthday celebration in a way, and birthdays are all about presents and getting presents, except I always contend that it's the fans who continue to get the gifts. So what is Goodfellas' greatest gift to viewers?
I think the greatest gift to viewers is, again, the vitality of the movie and the kind of complicated emotions that you'll feel watching and running through it, from hilarity to, moral abhorrence. You don't get that kind of dynamic range in a motion picture very often. And the fact that it's got this kind of variety of emotional and visceral experiences going for it is, I think, the gift that keeps on giving.
So true.
And the depth of the film and the interesting things that happen to its real-life perpetrators, including Henry Hill, is a big theme of my book, which I think will enhance any Goodfellas fans' experience of the movie next time they look at it.
I'm sure it will. I actually have 4 gifts, and I'm going to rattle them off as quickly as I can, but I thought long and hard about this, and sometimes I only come up with one major gift, but this movie's in my top 10. This is a personal, one of the best to me. So it means a lot, and every time I see it, it just takes on more resonance, and certainly true 30 years later. But I believe Goodfellas' greatest gift is that it satiates. It satiates like a cinematic bouillabaisse, if you will, with the combination of multiple quality ingredients, creating a thoroughly satisfying and lip-smacking experience. So there's so many ingeniously interwoven elements of excellence on display here, Glenn. You got fascinating characters galore, ultra-credible dialogue, a kinetic camera that's moving a lot, compelling voiceover narration, inspired visual and musical editing choices, engrossing episodes that play like mini movies within the movie. I mean, you could have gone in so many different tangents and directions with different characters or situations here and then made all kinds of spin-off movies, right? You think of the period and occupational authenticity of Goodfellas, which is astounding. The emphasis on fine, small details that enhance the personalities, the settings, and the situations. And above all, infectious passion for the subject matter. I mean, Scorsese is just so passionate about what he's telling here as far as the story. And gift number 2 to me is its credibility as a plausible cautionary tale. I do think that there's a bit of a message here, and you don't have to be moralizing or sermonizing as the filmmaker to tell it, but this movie feels real and honest to me, not just because it's based on true life people and events that actually happened, but because the talents involved, they aimed for veracity. They aimed for emotional sincerity and superior storytelling that was designed to enthrall from the first frame to the last. This film may not surpass The Godfather in many books, but I think it belongs on the Mount Rushmore of mob movies, and unlike The Godfather, it's not a work of fiction. Now, it's somewhat fictionalized, but it's based on true story and characters and situations. So my third gift, briefly, is the array of colorful characters who get indelibly etched into our pop culture consciousness, right? So you think about, of course, Tommy, and Pesci wins the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor, of course, and deservingly so, but you got Jimmy, you got Henry, Karen, and Paulie. Those are the major players, but then you think about like the unforgettable bit players, like Billy Bats, Spider, Frenchie, Maury, Tuddy, Sonny, on and on and on. These are all so colorful, these characters. And what's amazing about Goodfellas is that everyone, to me anyway, is so perfectly cast. Even the thespians and the non-speaking roles who kind of blend into the background. They have these time-worn faces and idiosyncrasies about them that make this underworld universe so believable, right? And lastly, Glenn, gift number 4 to me is the astounding sequence near the end of the picture that you already talked about at such great length that details the day that Henry's arrested. What is it, May 11th, you said?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's relayed in this cocaine-infused rush of, like, pressure cooker paranoia in which you hear musical extracts, you see these quick jarring cuts, you get these timeline-stamped shots, these unpredictable compositions that are in constant motion that coalesce into an unforgettable montage of increasing dread and tense anticipation. And I personally think this is the finest 10 minutes of filmmaking that Scorsese has ever conjured up. So that's my 2 cents on Goodfellas and its greatest gifts.
It's right up there, that's for sure.
Where does this rank for you in Scorsese's filmography?
It's definitely in the top 5. I mean, I don't like ranking as a rule, but it's certainly up there. There are films that are more moving in a way, such as Last Temptation, certainly, and Age of Innocence. But this is the one that is the most moving in the sense of it rocks your world. And, you talk about those unforgettable characters. A lot of the book that I've written about Goodfellas, Made Men, goes into a lot of detail about the people who played those mob guys. Tutty, a guy named Frank DeLeo, who was Michael Jackson's manager, believe it or not.
Wow, okay.
So a lot of real-life mobsters in the Bamboo Lounge there, a lot of ex-cops. They were kind of like herding cats for the first assistant director. So in Made Men, the story of Goodfellas, my book, you'll be able to get little portraits of all those characters. So,
that's so cool.
And a detailed breakdown of the movie, including the May 11th sequence.
Do you think Goodfellas will still be widely watched and considered relevant in, let's say, another 30 years? What's going to be the legacy of this film 3 decades from now?
It's hard to say. The fact that we're talking about it 30 years after its first release is a good sign. And I certainly think that Scorsese's body of work is one that's going to be as avidly studied as the work of Alfred Hitchcock. Alfred Hitchcock's first films from the silent era are 100 years old. So I'm pretty sure that the shelf life of Scorsese's filmography will get to the age of 100, if not more.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that this movie has legs, it has an evergreen nature to it, and it's going to continue to influence other works even 30 years after its release. So, all right, Glenn, so getting back to your book, I cannot wait to check this out. So what prompted you to write it?
It was a film that looms large for me in my life, early in my days as a journalist. The first time I interviewed Martin Scorsese was when he was editing the film. So I've always had a special interest in it. And it was a project that the publisher and I worked out. When the publisher heard this was something we had in mind, had a meeting with his staff, and all they did was talk about, sit there quoting lines from the movie. So that's how it got off the ground, was just everybody's enthusiasm.
Yeah.
When it became a book idea was just so infectious that we just couldn't stop ourselves, so to speak.
That's awesome. And now, did you secure new interviews with any of the cast or filmmakers?
I have new interviews with Martin Scorsese, the director, Robert De Niro. There's a lot of below-the-line people, the people who know where the bodies are buried who I spoke to, including the first assistant director, Joseph Reedy, the props master, Bob Griffin, the production designer. I think it's a book that, despite the fact that Goodfellas has been written about so much and discussed so much and litigated so much, I think there's going to be a few things in there that will still surprise some people.
Oh, this is so exciting. Can't wait to get my hands on the book and to dig deeper into that. And was there anything else you're working on as far as an upcoming article or series or anything else online, for example?
I write film reviews for the New York Times, and they appear now because of the scheduling of movie releases because of the pandemic. They appear throughout the week in the Times. Also, RogerEbert.com is a place where my film reviews appear, and you can look for my byline at either of those two renowned publications.
Wonderful. Glenn, I want to thank you again for taking the time to talk to me.
It's been a real pleasure, Eric. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I look forward to the book, and we will continue to look for your works online and in print as well. So, Glenn, my extreme thanks and gratitude.
Thank you.
It's pretty cool that in the couple of weeks since I recorded that interview with Glenn, he and his new book have been all over the news and the internet with the media in full Goodfellas 30th anniversary commemoration mode. So yeah, what a stroke of good luck to nab Glenn at exactly the right time. As they say, sometimes life just throws you a bone, right? Now, time for another round of standing ovations. This is the time I give a shout out to a movie, book, TV program, podcast, website, or other kind of work that I think would be of interest to classic film lovers. For September, my pick is actually a fitting one. A Goodfellas Steelbook edition packed with 3 discs. You got 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray on 1 disc, a regular Blu-ray disc of the movie, and a 3rd disc with bonus features. Heads up, however, this is a Best Buy exclusive. That means you can't get it anywhere else right now but Best Buy. And it appears to be selling out pretty quickly. So if you're into collecting classic movies on 4K Blu-ray, you're going to want to act fast on this one. Now, I don't have this in hand, but apparently you get the same extra features that were found on the 25th anniversary edition of Goodfellas, which includes a commentary from Martin Scorsese, commentary with ex-gangster Henry Hill and ex-FBI agent Edward McDonald, the excellent feature-length documentary Public Enemies, the golden age of the gangster film, several very good cast and crew documentaries, you got trailers for the movie, and even 4 Warner Brothers mob-themed old-timey cartoons. Now, thankfully, this won't set your wallet back too far. It only retails for a little over $20. So if you want to own and rewatch Goodfellas in the highest quality format possible, this purchase is a no-brainer. Provided it hasn't sold out by the time you hear this, that is. If you can't get your hands on it, chances are, however, that Warner Brothers will re-release it as a non-exclusive relatively soon. That's my hunch, anyway. Instead of cluttering up our podcast with advertisements, we've decided to ask our listeners for their support. We could use your help to offset the costs to produce Cineversary, which includes expenses like podcast hosting provider fees. If you'd like to make a monetary contribution to the Cineversary podcast in any amount, large or small, we've made it safe and simple by partnering with PayPal to collect the funds. Simply visit tinyurl.com, that's tinyurl.com/donate Cineversary, and click on the Donate button. Any major credit card is accepted, and the entire transaction is handled securely and confidentially by PayPal. Or if you're familiar with PayPal, you can simply send us a payment in any amount you want to cineversegroup@gmail.com, and that's spelled CINEVERSE group@gmail.com. We really appreciate your generosity. Also, I'd love to hear what you think of our Cineversary podcast. You can email me suggestions or comments at cineversegroup@gmail.com. And I encourage you to visit cineversegroup.com, the portal for my film discussion group that I launched in 2005, where you can hear podcast recordings of our group discussions and read more about the movies we study. Okay, we've come to the end of yet another episode, but I'm already gearing up for next month's edition, which you will not want to miss. It will be October, of course, the month of Halloween, and appropriately, we are going to spotlight one of the greatest horror films ever created, none other than Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which turned 60 years old this year. This has been your humble host, Eric Martin, reminding you to butter up that popcorn, live a big screen surround sound life, stay safe and healthy throughout this pandemic, and cherish those classic movies, folks, because they're not getting older, they are just getting better. Thanks again for giving us a listen.